Awesome. Okay, so just to begin, welcome everyone to our last career panel of the day. My name is Maggie Chen, and I'm a current junior at Harvard College studying developmental biology and the history of science. I'm also the Chief Development Officer at the Journal of Young Investigators. And I'm going to pass it off to my co-host, Thrishit, to first introduce himself and then to introduce our panelists. Another thing to watch out for is that we have a Q&A box that we will definitely be asking questions from at the end of the panel. So please do submit all of your questions. This is an amazing group of students and also role models for people all over the world. So we're super excited to speak with them this afternoon. So I'll pass it over to Thrishit.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Good evening, everyone. I'm Trishit, and I'm a development officer at JYI, and I'm currently a graduate student at the Hoku University in Japan. It's such a delight and honor to have this panel with us tonight. So, introducing each of you, I'll be giving a short introduction. We have Daniel Shi, who is a third year medical student at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Daniel's most recent project is a systemic review and meta analysis in cardiac surgery. We have Dr. Lauren Hagler, who is a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford University. In her research, Lauren combines organic chemistry, chemical biology, genomics, etc., in her pursuit to understand the fundamental molecules of life. We have Dr. Danika Hawthorne, who is a third year obstetrics and gynecology resident at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. Danika's current research involves maternal positioning for optimal fetal position for vaginal deliveries. We have Janani Hariharan, who is a PhD candidate at Cornell University. Janani studies the microbial ecology of soil bacteria. She's also a science writer and podcaster and writes and talks about microbiology, environmental studies, and graduate school culture. And we're also having Jeff Chen, who is a MD PhD candidate at University of California, Irvine. His current work focuses on the role of transcription factors, and he was also a post-baccalaureate IRTA fellow at the National Institutes of Health. Over to you, Maggie.
Awesome. So I don't know if Jeff will be able to join us today. I think it seems like an emergency, but we have a really incredible group of speakers, like I've said earlier. So I think let's just get started with some questions. So my first question is to really everybody. You all come from a variety of scientific backgrounds, but they're all really interesting backgrounds. So we'd love to hear a brief summary about, your life as a student, how you came to do the research work that you do now, and sort of what training did you pursue and what degree are you pursuing now? And let's get started with Dr. Hagler because she's first on my screen.
Hi, thank you guys for having me. I'm Lauren Hagler, and I kind of got into chemistry, especially as a research field. I started off as a pre-health major. I had the ambition of going to medical school. I started doing research in my junior year of undergraduate and was really inspired by the ways that I could use medicine, not at the bedside, in terms of like thinking about ways to make new drugs. Also, my cat will probably be joining us today. But yeah, so that's how I got into research, and in particular drug discovery. And then I decided to pursue a PhD in chemistry with that same goal. And actually what got me into RNA chemistry and thinking about drug discovery was a little girl who had the disease that we were actually studying in my PhD work. And I just like really felt like I should help her. And so it kind of combines like my love for medicine, but also my love for research. And so that's how I ended up where I am now at Stanford, again, studying RNA biology.
That's amazing. Really combining all of your interests into one thing. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Let's move to Daniel, who's also next on my screen.
Hey, hi everyone. Thanks for having me, and thanks Maggie and Trisha for the introduction. So as Dave mentioned, I'm a student currently in Canada. I'm in my third year of medical school at Queen's University, so that's what I'm currently pursuing. I got into research when I was in my undergrad, and that's when I did my bachelor's in health sciences at McMaster University. That was a 4-year degree. And I kind of wanted to see more of what was out there in terms of the science world because I was pursuing a science undergrad. And so I thought, hey, why not get involved in research? Why not reach out to a couple of professors? And long story short, I ended up doing a lot of work in systematic review and meta-analysis. So it's basically a type of knowledge synthesis where we gather a lot of smaller studies that are in the primary literature and sort of sum it up and comment on the overall state of knowledge and what we know from that kind of research. Currently, I'm interested in research as well because, as you know, research is very important to medicine. It's very important in evolving practice and also even in coming up with new treatments for different types of practices in medicine. So generally, right now, I'm interested in research that's clinically oriented. And as you mentioned before as well, my summer project involved looking at surgical outcomes following cardiac surgery. So that's the kind of research that I'm currently pursuing right now.
Awesome. It's great to hear you can integrate research still too as a medical student. You kind of get the best of both worlds there. Alrighty, I'll pass it to Janani to comment next.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me and thanks for the introduction. So I'm Janani, I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm a PhD candidate at Cornell University. So as Trish had said, I study what's called microbial ecology. So I study the ecology and evolution of bacteria that live in the soil. And I'm trying to understand, can we find patterns in how biodiversity is structured around the world? And my particular domain happens to be soil, but people do this with oceans, people do this with glaciers, with so many different types of environments. And my passion for microbiology really began as an undergraduate student in India. So I grew up in India and I moved to the US when I was 20 for graduate school. I'm an international student. And when I was taking an undergraduate microbiology lab, it was this magical moment for me because one minute I saw this glass slide on which there were like dots, like black dots, and then I put them under the microscope and whoa, I just saw this whole big microbial world under the microscope, which really opened my eyes to the ubiquitousness and just the so many functional roles that microbes fulfill in all of our lives. And so from there, I just got interested in all these different questions about the microbial world, and my research has been guided by those questions. And so after my undergraduate education, I moved to the US. I went to the Ohio State University for a master's degree in environmental science, and now I'm at Cornell after having worked for a couple years at a startup.
Awesome. So we'll pass it off to Jeff, who's also one of my mentors. So great to see you, Jeff. The question, I think we might have missed it when you hadn't come yet, but the question is, if you could give a brief summary of sort of your scientific background, your training, and a little bit about the work that you do now.
Yeah, sure. So hey, everybody, I'm Jeff. I am an MD PhD candidate at UC Irvine in California. And let's see, so I first became interested in science from like the Magic School Bus, watching those little cartoons. I especially remember that cartoon where they kind of shrink the little school bus and you go into the human body. That was really cool. And so, yeah, so I started dabbling into research, environmental science in high school, and sorry, my dog, and yeah, and so that's how I sort of came to that. And in college, I did environmental toxicology, but I still dabbled a little bit in biomedical sciences. So I did clinical research. I did a little bit of basic science research. And I really liked it. I liked how the discovery portion, the way you communicate science, and decided to go into that. So yeah, so here I am. I'm at UC Irvine, yeah, so.
Awesome. Sounds good. Alrighty, we'll close it off with Dr. Hawthorne.
Hi, I'm Danika. I'm one of the OB-GYN residents here in Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada. And so my path to kind of where I got to today, when I was in high school, I always thought that I wanted to go to veterinary school. So then I ended up applying to the University of Guelph, which is where the veterinary college is for Ontario. And then while I was there pursuing a degree in biomedical science, I realized that I was really in love with the medicine and kind of wanted to be able to practice to the full scope of it. And one of the things that I found frustrating with veterinary medicine, and being blessed to be living in Canada, that in Canada, healthcare, there isn't often a financial stop point, whereas with veterinary medicine, a lot of the time there is. And so then I kind of switched gears and decided to apply to medical school. I applied across the country and only interviewed at one school. So I was like fully planning on doing my master's because I had started some research in like benchwork lab research in one of the labs at the University of Guelph. And that lab focused on leopard geckos, since they have the ability to regenerate their tails, which is pretty cool. And so we were looking at other parts of the gecko because we had pretty well described how the regeneration process had worked in the gecko tail. So then different members of the lab were looking at different parts of the gecko. Mine happened to be hearts. And so we had a group of geckos that were injected with a tracer. And so cells that were turning over would take up the tracer. And then basically what we were looking for is these long or slow cycling cells, because some evidence had shown that these slow cycling cells might have stem-like properties. And so I was really like kind of the first member of the lab to look at the hearts. So I was very early on in this research. And yeah, I was geared up to do my master's and continue with my gecko hearts, but then I got into med school, which was fantastic. And so switch gears a little bit. The school that I went to was the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, which is very different from traditional medical schools. We're very clinically based. We only had one lecture a week in small group learning, which allowed us to work with patients and in the clinic as much as possible. We did have a requirement in medical school to do a research project. I was training even more rurally than some of my classmates in med school. And so I was looking at the provision of obstetrical care in rural communities and how necessary that is, as needing to travel long distance to have a baby can be quite hindersome to some families. And as you could probably guess, I then decided to apply to Obstetrics and Gynecology and match to the University of Alberta. And again, as most clinicians will tell you, like research is not only a passion, but a requirement for most programs. And so the project that I'm currently working on is looking at different positions and techniques and stuff that mom can use in labor in order to get baby to be in the optimum position to have a vaginal delivery. And we're very early on in the stages of that. So just working on the ethics process.
Awesome. So great to see such a wide variety of fields represented in this call today. So I think the next couple of questions will kind of dive a little bit deeper into, the work that you do and kind of how you got there. So I love to start with Lauren. Your research background is very interdisciplinary and kind of bridges chemistry and biology and a lot of different fields. And how has this approach sort of helped you in formulating your research work? And what are the advantages to conducting research that is so interdisciplinary?
Yeah, so I actually never intended for my research to be as highly interdisciplinary as it was. I started off as a organic chemistry PhD student because I wanted to synthesize small molecule drugs. And I quickly found out that I was just not comfortable with not knowing enough about the entire drug discovery process, from design to synthesis to testing in whatever cellular or animal model that we were using. So I just kept getting so interested in like what the collaborators were doing from a theoretical standpoint that was informing the decisions that we were making in terms of what molecules to synthesize, and then passing it on to the biologists who did the cells. And as I got a little bit more into all of those pieces, I began to pick up more skills and begin to think about like, okay, well, having these collaborations and these relationships is really nice, but I would love to be able to do all of this myself. So I think there's a lot of advantages to doing highly interdisciplinary work. One, it helps you build relationships across different fields of science. So it's not just what you know as an organic chemist or whatever, but now it's what you're open yourself up to a wide variety of fields. And then also taking ownership of that project, even if you are kind of, say, like an orchestra leader of your own project, like being able to converse with your collaborators in different fields is also nice. And kind of how that moves forward to my postdoc work is I have always been really interested in translational research, but I realized that the gap in my knowledge now is basic science. I don't fully understand, or I don't think I fully understand like how mechanisms happen within a body. So that's kind of like the next tool that I'm adding to my collective toolbox.
Wonderful. And it seems like there's so much interest in RNA biology, DNA biology, especially now in this pandemic. So does that make you feel like your work is, more relevant, more important as well in this day and age?
Yeah, I mean, I saw a tweet that said that 2020 was going to be the year of the RNA. And I thought, like, okay, well, haven't we been studying RNA for 20 or 30 years? Like, we had all these opportunities to have the RNA, but actually, it turned out that it ended up being widely useful. So yeah, it's a fun time to be in that space.
Yeah, I loved seeing modified RNA trend on Twitter. I was like, 2020 brought us one thing that is interesting, which is RNA trending on Twitter.
Yeah.
But that's awesome. Alrighty, I'll put the next question to Jeff. So you did a postdoc or postbac, sorry, at NIH before you entered an MD PhD program. And so why did you choose to do that? And how do you think this experience maybe helped you doing your research now?
Well, truthfully, I actually did it because I wanted to travel somewhere outside of California. um, so I think so when you're done with undergrad, you're like 21-ish. You still have a lot of time, and especially if you want to explore other areas of research. And so I think I did a postbac at the NIH because I wanted to make sure that this was something I really wanted to do, because I feel like I was going to make like a heavy commitment to joining a graduate program. So um, yeah, and so I think it's fine to take like a year or two off. Sometimes a lot of people are very headstrong and want to go directly right into med school or master's program or whatever. Um, but yeah, so I think it's a good experience just to try something new. It's only like a year or two or so years, just to give it a trial run to see if it's something you like before making like a big commitment to it. Yeah.
Awesome. Alrighty, my next question is going to be to Daniel. So as we all know, research can be a little bit difficult sometimes when you're faced with not great results or loneliness in the lab when you're the only person there at 10 p.m. or something. How would you give advice, from both a medical student perspective, because I know that medicine is a very tough career to go into, to find balance and also to not burn out, I guess, to keep going in this academic process?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I think that it's important for sure to talk about. When you go into research, or even when you go into like most academic pursuits, one thing to keep in mind is to actually expect setbacks and to expect certain things not to work out. And I know that a lot of the times it's easy for us when we pursue a long and difficult project to come in with expectation going like, this is going to work out, this is going to be smooth sailing. And when something doesn't work out, it's easy to associate that with your identity, to say, oh, I failed, like this was my fault, this must, like how am I going to get through this project now? And the key thing to keep in mind is like, most of the time, in fact, it's actually not your fault. It's just the nature of the project. And especially in research, there's gonna be a lot of times where you get negative results. There's a lot of times where like you have to go back and redo a lot of the process from the beginning. And I've definitely experienced that as well, even not doing wet lab research, but rather my research focusing on knowledge synthesis and gathering primary studies. A lot of times where I have to go back and realize, oh, I didn't understand the literature as well as I should have. And therefore I have to rework sort of the search strategy and the articles that I gathered. So that can be disappointing and that can be disheartening for sure. But expecting those setbacks and knowing that they're not always your fault is, I think, a key step of moving forward and being able to persist in those research endeavors.
Awesome. It's great to think about too, sort of how to get past these things. So thank you for your advice on that. Alrighty, next up is Janani. So you did your bachelor's in biotech and your master's in environmental science, and you talked a little bit about how now you work in microbial ecology, which is very similar to other speakers here, a very interdisciplinary type of field. And so did you plan this at all in the beginning, sort of the route that you took and your research interest? And if you didn't, how did you find your way to what you're doing now?
I did not. I did not plan any of this. I think, I tried. I remember when I was younger, I had like plans and I'm going to be done with this when I'm 25 and I'm going to be done with that when I'm 30 and so on. And I'm not 30 yet, but none of those things are happening. It's just important for me, I think, at every step to think about okay, what am I interested in right now and how can I move that forward? Because it's just important to understand for me what I can control and what I can't control. And the way I went about searching for programs or research internships and experiences was really just asking myself that question over and over. What am I interested in? How much time am I committing to it? And can I see myself staying interested and passionate about this topic for if it was like an undergraduate research experience, maybe 3 or 4 months. If it was a master's program, it was 2 years and so on, And so I completely agree with what Jeff said about taking some time. I worked at a startup for a year between my master's and my PhD, sort of to reevaluate for myself. How do I feel about this? Are there other fields that I would like to explore and see if they're a better fit than what I'm doing right now? And of course, I had the luxury and the privilege of being able to do that. Some people don't. But I just think it's important to sort of evaluate for me at the end of every sort of landmark professionally is what is my next step and is it consistent? And the nice thing about all of the graduate programs that I applied to was that they were very interdisciplinary by nature. So I was encouraged to take courses and meet with faculty who were working on so many different aspects. So at Ohio State, for example, it was mandatory for us to take courses in physical sciences, in biological sciences, and in the social sciences. And I don't work in the social sciences much today, but it enriched my knowledge base so much and it enriched my experiences and understanding of what the field was to take that course and interact with that professor. And so that's my biggest takeaway is just sort of branching out of my comfort zone a little bit now, attending seminars from other departments, going to things that might feel a little bit unfamiliar because overall, it's just helped me take that next step and find out what are the tools I need to move on and solve that problem, even if they happen to come from other fields. So yeah, to answer your question, it wasn't deliberate, but I think it's a very necessary skill given how interdisciplinary and fast-paced research is these days.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And Danika, you've also talked a little bit about how your path was a little bit windy in terms of going to vet school, then going to med school. And so I'd love to hear about how your research integrates into your work now. Like you talked a little bit about how you're looking at optimal positions for vaginal delivery. Do you anticipate to hopefully implement that in the clinic in the future? And do you see that as a possibility? And how might we get there from just the research and the clinical perspective to actually implementing it on patients?
So the project that I'm working on now actually stemmed from some of the techniques that some of our senior nurses have been using in the labor and delivery department. And so like humans have been having babies forever, literally forever. And we've only really had the ability to do a C-section within the last like century without causing serious morbidity and mortality to the mother. And while we're really good at that now, optimizing a mom for a vaginal delivery is going to have the best outcomes for mom and baby as long as both are healthy and there's no other concerns. And so like working with like my nursing colleagues, they were using these techniques out of a program that they had done extra training in, but these techniques in the program itself hasn't been formally studied at all. So the project that I'm working on ethics for now is a prospective cohort study. And so essentially looking at moms who are, most moms would be eligible on our labor and delivery floor. And if they're interested in participating, just seeing that if having those interactions with the healthcare workers with extra training changes the chance of them having a C-section or having a successful vaginal delivery.
Awesome. That's really, really cool.
It's fun.
It's great to hear how research, remains to be a part of your life, no matter what postgrad path that you're taking. So the next topic that I wanted to broach is science communication, which is obviously a huge thing that I think maybe is becoming more and more emphasized, especially in the past year. I think it's just becoming more apparent that there are a lot of inequities that are present in medicine and in science that we need to improve on. So how can we best be able to communicate these really archaic and difficult concepts to the general public, to everybody, to make sure that they understand, those key facts and that crucial information? And this is open to anybody, whoever wants to answer, just unmute and go for it.
I can start. So I think there are two types of science communication. There's science communication for other scientists who may not be in your direct field. And then there is science communication for the layperson, your family members, say, for instance. And I think that a lot of times what we're calling science communication is actually science communication for other scientists. And we're not really distilling it down to something that is tangible to just, your regular Joe on the street. So I think that we should spend a lot more time talking to our families. It's been really interesting with the vaccine that's come out now, like how much I have to go back to basics to describe the vaccine to people around me. I mean, being someone who studies RNA, people always look to me and say, hey, like explain this vaccine to me and how they have gotten it through the clinic this fast. What is it actually doing? Am I going to grow another limb? And that conversation looks very different when you're, telling an organic chemist versus when you're telling your family members. So I think that's something really important to think about in science communication. Are you actually communicating to other scientists, or are you actually, doing the true work of communicating it to a broader audience?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Thank you for those words of advice and wisdom. That's super helpful. I think also from a writing perspective as well, when doing science writing, it's always really, I think one of the favorite questions that I have when I do journalism work is, can you explain this to a fifth grader, or can you explain this to your mom? And I think that definitely helps people sort of distill it down to something that might be understandable for somebody who doesn't really have any scientific training background. So yeah, definitely something to think about. And I'd love to get Janani's opinion on this, since you do a lot of science communication and writing yourself.
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in. I think that's a really good point. Sometimes the toughest questions and the toughest science communication we might have to do is often to our families and close intimate circles. And I think what's really crucial, especially when we're engaging people outside of the scientific community, is trust building. And it's such a complicated concept, because I think science and medicine have in the past let down communities. There is a reason that certain communities especially don't trust scientists or don't trust doctors. And, here in the US, especially Black and Indigenous communities have good reason to mistrust the systems that exist. And so I find it really important to come at it from a place of actual listening, not just being the condescending scientist who walks into the room and wants to do an information dump and say, hey, here's why I'm right, here's why you're wrong, and here's why you should take the vaccine. Even though, unfortunately, that is my first instinct sometimes, is to just bombard people with the facts and say, hey, here's all the information, here's a fact sheet, here's why it's good for you. But it's really important to think about, why is there resistance? Sometimes it's trust, sometimes it's lack of information, sometimes it's the communities and the conversations that are happening in those communities that need to shift a little bit before acceptance grows. And so it's just important to think about, where's that resistance coming from, and how can I, not just as a scientist, but as a human being, actually connect with this person, make myself more relatable, and then have this conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Having that empathy and the compassion is so important, especially in this day and age. Does anybody else want to weigh in on this topic?
Yeah, I can comment, just because I pretty much do this at work every day, and that's been it's one of the hardest parts of like going from being like an undergraduate student or medical student to going to be a physician. And I get to be with families at some of like the happiest moments of their lives, some of the most difficult moments of their lives. And so like trying to humanize the information is definitely a challenge. I just completed my rotation on maternal fetal medicine. And so we're scanning babies all day, every day, and sometimes delivering very difficult news. And some of the terminology and phrases that I like to use is always asking the patient what their understanding of why they're there today. And then if they have any specific questions, fears, or concerns that they wanted to go over today, because and when you walk into that room, like I know the information that I'm going to want to tell them about what we've found out and kind of what the plan will be from there. But a lot of the times they have different questions, or they have a different perception that oftentimes can surprise me. And it's so much easier just to ask up front what their concerns are, and then address those head on, and then kind of like talk about whether, yeah, that's a valid concern, this is what our plan is going to be for it, or like, actually, I'm not so much worried about that, I respect that you are, but here's the reasons why I'm not. And I think, especially being in obstetrics and gynecology, we really feel that distrust of the medical system frequently. I think more frequently now, more than ever. which is always a challenge, especially at like 4 in the morning when I'm probably not the best version of myself. But like it's small things. It's like addressing your patients by their names. It's sitting on the bed with them, taking the time to chat when you are able to. And like when I do get paged away for an emergency, whenever I'm able to return to that patient, like I always apologize for having to leave and say, don't worry, when I need to run for you, I'll run for you too. And so those are just the kind of things that I like to keep in my toolbox when talking about these kinds of difficult conversations.
Wow, for sure. All important lessons here to learn. Daniel, I think you unmuted quickly.
Yeah, so I just wanted to echo some of the stuff that's already said, and very excellent points that misinformation, people don't believe in misinformation just because they believe that they're right or that they know better than scientists, but they often have a lot of reasons for it, and we don't know what their reasons are because science and medicine especially, there have been a lot of inequities in the past, and we know that there's demonstrated examples of how we could have done better for specific communities, for minorities, for various groups of people actually, like even in the research that I mentioned that I was doing earlier, it focuses on gender differences in cardiac surgery outcomes. And we know that women don't do as well as men after coronary artery bypass grafting or CABG. So, and that can come from research too, because in the past, a lot of these studies recruited mainly men to examine the clinical features of the presentation of myocardial infarction or heart attack. And because women weren't represented, we didn't realize that those women actually presented with different clinical features. So they often had later presentations of disease, and that's why it was more difficult to provide them with a good outcome. So definitely people who believe in misinformation, it's important not to dismiss that, to say, oh, like I don't believe like you have good reasons for like believing this kind of information, and to acknowledge those concerns, to say yes, in the past, like, you know, we don't like the medicine, the science and the research hasn't always been there, it hasn't done the best that it could have, but now, like given light of this new information, we're hoping to change that.
Yeah, for sure. We're always working to be more inclusive rather than exclusive. Jeff, do you have anything to add at all to this discussion?
No, I think everybody covered it very, very well. So yeah, I would agree.
Awesome. All righty. So another question that I think a lot of students have is, what do we do starting out now, like as undergrads, which is, you know, where this is an organization that is geared towards undergrads in research and giving publishing opportunities to people from all over the world, no matter where they're from, no matter what they do. So how can we maybe get started in our careers, and how might we best navigate the difficulties of maybe pursuing a career in science? And maybe we can start with Lauren again, so we do like a circular thing.
Yeah, my biggest advice I give undergraduate researchers is to build a habit of reading the literature. So, you know, whether it's, some people like the paper a day goal, and some people like, well, I want, you know, to be well versed in this area. But reading the literature is the most important thing that a scientist can be doing. I like to say that you should be thinking twice as more than you are doing. And so if you're spending that time reading literature, then you're definitely going to be helping yourself in the long run when you get ready to run those experiments. But also taking it a step further and not just reading about the things that you're doing right now, but what would you like to be doing for, you know, the rest of your life, and where is science moving forward? Try to be reading things that are on, you know, the brink of discovery, and not just kind of what you're studying right now.
Awesome. Yeah, always thinking one step ahead, so you can get faster to where you're going. Awesome. Anybody else want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, so I'll add on to what Laura said. So I would definitely agree about thinking about what you want to do. I remember like in interviews, you would always ask, oh, where do you see yourself in 30 years? Like, where do you see yourself in 30 years? And in my mind was like, I don't know, like maybe I'll have like 4 dogs or something, or, but yes, just think about what you want to do, maybe not what the degree you want to get. So for example, if you really enjoy patient contact, maybe instead of doing an MD, PhD, you could just go into medicine, just do an MD. And you can always do clinical research on the side. If you really enjoy the technical aspect of research, like you really enjoy running samples, even if you get positive or negative results, you can do a master's and maybe you can work in biotech or something like that. And maybe not necessarily you would need to do a PhD and go through all that toil. So yes, maybe just spend the time that you have in undergrad, exploring different fields, just having the time to just see what other stuff is like. And if you find out you enjoy it, then that's great. Then you find something that you would like to do in 30 years.
Awesome. I'm going to pass it to Danika.
Sure, and I'll just kind of echo that, like, finding a strong mentor is always an asset. So like I ended up doing the undergrad research not that I was doing, not so much because I was really interested in gecko hearts, but because like the anatomy class that I took was with the lab that I ultimately ended up in. And I jived really well with my supervisor and like worked really well within the lab, and that kind of cohesive environment that like you're excited to go into the lab and it's not like this drag that you wanted, like you kind of dread at the end of every day is really great. Because I had never really considered doing a master's until I started working in the lab. I'm like, cool, I can do this for a couple more years. Like, this is great. And then it kind of continued into medical school and whatnot. Like, even my supervisor now, like it's one of my staff who like we get along really well and we have similar interests, and like actually doing research and things that you're interested in versus kind of just checking that box for either like an application or a requirement or whatever makes it a whole lot easier, because especially when you're balancing like a hectic like clinical and work career, oftentimes, like I'm not gonna lie, it's tough to come home and then like read some papers and keep up to date when all I really want to do is sleep. But when you're interested in it, it's still enjoyable, right? So like, and not only like keeping your interest in the work that you're doing, but balancing that with like your family, your friends, your other interests, make you a better, well-rounded person, and definitely help in keeping everything balanced.
Awesome. Yeah, work-life balance, super important thing. Daniel or Janani?
Yeah, so I would say like my biggest advice for under any undergrad student actually is to sort of get out there and see what kind of research is out there. Whether that be research in a wet lab, which is what most people typically imagine, I would think, and then there's also dry lab research, and maybe even if you could help out with like clinical research, like those are all very different experiences. And I remember being an undergrad student and not having a lot of experience and not knowing what was out there, having any skills on my resume for that matter as well. I remember wanting to sort of find out what is out there and experiencing those things. That's the biggest favor you can do yourself in the future, because then you can say, oh, I really enjoyed X types of research, and that's the research you're going to pursue in the future. And really, like, you shouldn't be afraid to approach any kind of supervisor. You shouldn't be afraid to email or contact them, because the worst that can happen is they can say, no, I don't have any projects currently available right now. It's always important to put yourself out there and see what you're experiencing, or what you're you might have the passion for, in the future.
Yeah, I feel like people are generally pretty receptive too. If you just ask, they'll give you pointers to other people who might do similar research or give advice or something. So it's always a great thing. Alrighty, Janani, you want to close us off on this question?
I just want to echo Danika's point about mentors, because I found that the make or break factor in all of my research experiences has been the quality of mentorship. And I know that that was one of my biggest considerations when I was interviewing for PhD programs, seeing that fit with my potential advisor and just how I would feel working with this person for 5 years and potentially keeping in touch with them for the rest of my life. The two things I think that people haven't explicitly talked about yet are just asking questions. I was always curious, and I think that was one of the biggest reasons I got into research. I kept asking questions to a point where I couldn't find answers in the textbooks anymore. And some of them were not so great questions, but a couple of them turned out to be things that I eventually ended up working on. So I think a lot of us tend to suppress some of those questions, and we have this voice in our heads that's like, oh, that's a stupid question. Oh, people probably already know the answer to that question. And I do that when I'm in seminars, but really letting that flourish. I think letting your curiosity flourish, and actively paying attention to what are the questions you're asking. What are you most curious about? And the last thing is just getting used to failure, figuring out ways to develop resilience in the face of failure, because research is very much about making mistakes and going back to the drawing board. And I think we've talked about that a little bit. But just before it happens, developing a plan for yourself. How do you buffer? How do you get up the next morning and go back and make it happen again? Can be really useful.
Awesome. And I think that kind of leads into, so getting over failure, also self-care and work-life balance. So I'd love to hear what sorts of techniques or strategies that you all use to balance a really hectic research work life with, also having fun and keeping your mental sanity and seeing friends and all of those things.
Should I start again? Yeah, sure. So I make my daily schedule always the same number of things. So I base my productivity off how much I'm getting done and not how well things work out. This kind of goes back to Janani's point about like, how do you develop resiliency? Like, what do you use as your metric for a good day versus a bad day? So I always set my schedule to be 5 things only. And I do those 5 things. And then when they're done, I move on. It keeps me from getting burnt out, but it also allows me the freedom to say like, okay, well, it's 6 o'clock and I'm going home and I'm gonna make dinner and hang out with my cat right now or friends when we could do that. So having that plan or having your day based on something that isn't like, did my experiment work or not work, putting it in terms of productivity is how I manage my work life.
Awesome. That's such a cool strategy. I might use that later. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else want to add?
I guess I'll add. I think something I kind of learned early on into the graduate when I was doing my PhD is that your research or your grades, your successes, failures, they don't really define who you are. What defines you is, what you think of yourself. So if you think like, oh, I'm a failure because this experiment didn't work, then um, things are just going to go downhill from there. So it's always good to definitely to have another outlet or having friends to talk to, having hobbies to do, and just having some time to yourself. And so in some sense, maybe you can think of it kind of like a job. So you can think of it as like a 9 to 5 job, even though it's not really 9 to 5. It's just a job that you just leave in lab. And sometimes maybe in your office when you're reading some papers here or there, but yeah, just don't make it your whole entire life.
For sure, for sure. We need to have a life outside of work. That's very important. Alrighty. Anybody else want to add on our techniques or strategies?
I can kind of speak to some thoughts, especially that I've had in the past year, because of course everything's changed in the last year. And so one of the things that I've tried to continue doing throughout is really protecting time with like family or friends or whatever I'm doing, and really trying to like turn off the medical side of me. And that's been more difficult this year because medicine is constantly in the news, and I've been really struggling seeing social media feeds from friends or family, and it's very demoralizing to come home and try to dewind from a day where you're seeing positive patients all day, and then you go online and your friends don't think it's real. Like, it's really exhausting. But just kind of like protecting that time, and like when I had family events, when we used to do those, just like completely like turning off my phone, being away from everything else. I think that's a privilege that I still have as a resident. I know that some of the staff are less able to do that, even though like our hospital is set up where the staff cover each other's patients, but trying to continue that through. So it's not only through like research balance, but it's through balance in general, and just kind of prioritizing what's most important that day versus what's most important like on the weekend or whatever. And my friends and family know that when like I'm at work, they're not the number one priority. And I will be late for things, and I will have to cancel things, and I will have to miss important events sometimes. But just being open and honest with them, and having like those expectations set that when I am there, I'm there.
Yeah, for sure. The prioritization is such a key thing. And Daniel and Janani, any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I was, what I've started doing for myself in the last year or so, in the spirit of everything we talked about, right? Prioritizing, taking care of yourself, making those connections with people who are important to you and all of that. I have a little habit tracker that I fill out at the end of every day. And I like to use a paper planner, so I just have a small table in my planner. It could be digital, whatever works for you, right? But I will write down things that are important for me, and I want to remind myself to prioritize those things in the week. And they can be as simple as I want to cook 3 times a week, or I want to make sure I've connected with a friend or a family member today. Even if I had a really busy day, I want to make sure I picked up the phone for half an hour and called my partner, whatever that happens to be. I added working out a few months ago, but this is just a way for me to keep myself accountable and make sure that these don't just stay as good intentions, but I'm actually doing them in my life and I'm checking off a box when I do it. And so I can go back and say, over the weekend, I look at my week and I say, I had a very busy week and I ended up not doing any of the things that I wanted to do personally. So I'm going to take the weekend and actually do some of those things. That's a good way to keep that internal accountability.
Awesome. Yes, for sure. And Danielle, you want to finish us up on this question?
Yeah, for sure. And I first want to say I agree with everyone's points. I definitely think that organization is very important in maintaining that balance between work and life. What I just wanted to add is also to sort of know your limits, and everyone's limits are different. And you can sort of understand what capacity you have for work on a daily basis from experience and from self-reflection. So some days, maybe for me personally, some days I feel like I could work the whole day, like everything would be fine. But then being flexible enough to realize that not every day is going to be like that. And sometimes when you encounter setbacks, it's okay to take the rest of the day off, to take a self-care day. So that's important as well. So understanding who you are, and then not to be ashamed of that, and not to say like, oh, today I can't do any work. That's not your fault. That happens to everyone.
For sure. I feel like especially in this year too, it's so easy to get bogged down in everything, but your limits, as you said, are so important. Alrighty, so we're reaching the Q&A portion of this panel. So Trisha, I'll leave you to asking the questions that are appearing in the Q&A box. Again, attendees, if you have any other questions, feel free to submit them here on the webinar or in WOVA, which is our conference platform. So I'll be monitoring WOVA while Trisha asks this question.
I think because the one question we had here has already been answered about what are the tips and for beginners who don't have previous experience and where to start from. But if there is anybody who would like to add anything, definitely go ahead.
Yeah, especially on the point of no experience. I think that's a big question for a lot of people. Like, where do I start, if at all? If, I'm just starting university and I've never been in a lab before, how do I make that first initial jump?
I guess I can answer that. Yeah, it's very tough to just jump in, especially if you have no experience. But in some sense, you do have experience. You've done some research labs, you've done some like chemistry labs, biology labs. And a lot of times when you first go to university, you might have like a TA or something like that. You could definitely try to talk to them, try to get to understand their research, and maybe that could be a way in, because most TAs are grad students that have some research stuff going on. And it doesn't hurt to do cold calls or just emails. So you would just write emails to people. So most faculty or most departments have a list of faculty and the research that they do. So you can always just kind of go through that, skim through that, find ones that you like, and then just send them an email, somewhat personalized email, why you're interested in their research and why you want to join. Yeah, so just send out emails and talk to people.
For sure, for sure.
I'll add to this. I was that person in undergrad. Like, I didn't realize at the start of undergrad that people were doing research in labs. Like, I had no idea that was like a thing. My parents are lawyers. No one in my family is a scientist. Like, that was not, I had no idea like what to even expect. So I actually started doing research. I did 5 years in undergrad, and I started doing research my 4th year. And that was because at one point in a class, everyone was like, oh, I'm in this person's lab and this person's lab and this person's lab. And I was like, wait a second, like we're doing research? I was unaware. So if that is you and you're feeling like, you're coming to the end of your undergraduate or even after, like, it's fine to say like that's totally fine to start research whenever. And as Jeff was saying, just like email professors. I was taking a class at the time. I really enjoyed the class. I emailed the professor after the end of the class and said, hey, like, I really like your class. Can I do some research with you? And that got me my foot in the door.
I did that as well too. In my current undergrad, I totally emailed someone who I took a freshman class with and was like, I like your work. Let's hopefully work together maybe. And it worked out. So yeah, thank you for the strategy. Awesome. Anybody else have any other tips that they would like to share?
Yeah, I wanted to add something as someone who mentors undergraduates in the lab. I know that when I first started doing this and trying to get to work in people's labs, I was so anxious because I was like, oh, I don't know what I have to offer. I don't know much. I'm just an undergraduate and I have no experience. But now that I'm on the other side of that equation, I don't know that I needed to be that anxious, because when I start working with an undergraduate, my goals as a mentor are finding out what are your goals, what are you looking to do, and they don't have to be, I want to be an OBGYN. I don't need something as specific or as lofty as that. I'm just looking for what are you interested in and how can I make that happen for you in the next 4 years. So I am seeing it very much as a training opportunity. So what I expect my undergraduate mentees to bring to the table is some knowledge of their interests and what they would like to do with me over the course of the next 6 months or the next year. And just really a curiosity and dedication to doing what we commit to doing together. Those are really the biggest strengths, in my opinion.
For sure. And having graduate student mentors is always wonderful because I think you guys are very relatable, because you are just a couple years ahead of where we are. And so it's great to look up to that in the lab particularly. Danika, I saw you unmute as
Yeah, just to echo a couple of the other common themes. The professor that I ended up working with in undergrad, I had actually failed his midterm, and which was one of the few, I think, either one of the only or definitely the first like major failure in undergrad, which of course was earth shattering as I'm like preparing my medical school applications. And so then I worked with him like to work on the class, and then afterwards I'm like, well, like I really would love to be in his lab, but like I failed his midterm, like he's never going to let me in his lab. But like later on, and we were having a conversation, he's like, no, actually that's why I wanted you, because like I knew that I'd watched you fail and then come back from that. So like those, like the insecurities that all of us have, you need to remember that everyone's had failures, and kind of like what you do with those and what you learn from those experiences, kind of what really makes you a strong person. And then the other thing, just to echo, I know it's like, especially from an undergraduate level, like it seems like so far away to be able to like to talk to a resident or even like a med student. Like it's like we were in this ivory tower, but trust me, my tower is not ivory. And if anyone wants to come and help me with anything, that would be great. And I feel like most residents would also echo that, just because our clinical loads are so high, especially these days, that like, and it won't necessarily be very much fun for the things that I can like get you to do, but especially if you're doing like literature reviews or anything like that, or like coding things that take a really long time, and like time is a really precious resource for us. So I would say most of my co-residents, if they're looking for like a med student or an undergrad or anyone to help out on their research project, we'll teach you what you need to know to help us out, because like we're just happy to have the help.
awesome. Yeah, for sure. And Daniel, anything else to add here?
Yeah, and I think that what everyone said about, like emailing professors, reaching out, even cold emailing, or people that you kind of know through your professors or your TAs, like that's a great way to get involved in research. And what I would actually say is I also remember being that undergrad with no experience on the resume at all. And something to keep in mind is that what the most important thing to research, at least what I believe, isn't even like what you can put on your resume. It's not even the skills that you have, but rather the commitment and the willingness to learn that you're bringing. So when you email professors, oftentimes they'll, like, if they're interested in you, they will ask to meet. And when you get to that stage, something important to highlight is to say that while I don't have the skills, like I have a commitment and a passion for what you're doing, and I'm willing to take the time to learn this thing. And over time, that work commitment, that ethic is going to come out, and that's the most important thing in making it in any research career, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. I think someone said earlier, the passion is a requirement for having a good research career, and I feel like that's totally true. Awesome. So I think to wrap things up, we wanted to ask a kind of a fun question, which is, what is your favorite memory doing research, or in your career thus far? It can be happy, fun, anything that was memorable that you really cherish. And I think anybody can take that question starting off.
I can start this off. I'll give the disclosure of I struggled to pick one because obviously the day I got into medical school was very life-changing and very exciting and slightly terrifying. But then you kind of adjust to that. And then as I was going through medical school, I was always interested in women's health. And then I got to deliver my first baby. Blew my mind, and I'm just so impressed with women, and I'm still so impressed every day that this whole process works out. And so that was really awesome. And then I was toying between doing like family medicine, but still having an obstetrical practice versus going into like a surgical field like obstetrics and gynecology. And then I scrubbed into my first surgery and was like, oh shoot, now I get a surgery high, and now I'm going to be chasing that surgery high for the rest of my life. And so like deciding to become a surgeon was like a big step for me too. But then ultimately probably that final like match process to get into obstetrics and gynae, because we have very little control over what career we actually end up doing. So all of those are kind of led to where I am now, and I really can't pick between one.
Yeah, for sure. That's good to have a lot of good memories. Not a bad thing. Awesome. I think Lauren unmuted.
Yeah, I'll just say one. So I, as a graduate student, faced imposter syndrome, every other week, probably. And in my fourth year, we had to do an original research proposal, which is basically like based on your career trajectory, you write a grant, a fake grant of something you would do. So since I want to go into academia, I wrote a fake R1 grant, like I was, applying for an NIH R1. And we have to defend it in front of our committee. So I had written this grant and I had struggled through it over my Christmas break to turn it in, and I get ready to defend it and it wasn't going so well. And one of my committee members stopped me and said, Lauren, you have to realize that you are now the expert in this field. You have to bring it to a level that we can understand what you want to convey. And that was just like world changing for me. The realization that all this work that I had put into my PhD thus far, 4 whole years up to that point, and realizing that like I am the expert now. Now what do I do? And it kind of died down some of the imposter syndrome, or at least changed it into a new beast to deal with. But it was very memorable for me. The realization that your PhD is to become an expert in something, and I had achieved that.
That's amazing. That's really awesome to hear. I know a lot of people struggle, including me, and struggle with imposter syndrome, and I feel like nobody really talks about it, but we all have that internal little demon that's like, I can't do this, I'm not good enough. But that's amazing to hear, and so great. So anybody else want to take this?
I can go next. I don't know if this was fun necessarily, but it was certainly memorable. It was the first field trip that I took for my PhD. And I'd proposed to do this sampling on an elevational gradient, which meant that I had to hike up a mountain and then collect soil samples every 100 meters when I was coming down the mountain, which seemed really nice in theory, beautiful mountains, hiking, fun, soil, except I didn't train for it. And this is like the second highest peak in New York State. And I just kind of went along with it as if I was going on a stroll. Luckily, I had my partner with me. And this was also the summer when I happened to have tendonitis. So right as I got to the top of the mountain, my knees gave out and all of the sampling that we're supposed to do was on the way down. Great, just great. It all worked out, stars aligned. Somehow we make it to the bottom of the mountain and we realize that we're lost. And it's 8 p.m. This was summer. It was starting to get dark. We know there's bears and wolves in these mountains. And so we're walking around and around trying to find a way. Couldn't, kept walking in circles, called 911, got connected to some park rangers who helped us exit a different way than we came in, got picked up by the police on the highway and dropped off at our parking lot, and then had to drive 5 hours back to campus to store the soils. And I was carrying this big ice pack on my back too, because the soils have to be stored at a certain temperature, and I couldn't let the integrity of the research die, even if we were struggling and our body was numb with pain. But it's okay. We made it back, fully recovered, and the results were looking good. So.
Wow, just such dedication. That's an awesome story. Maybe we can go to Daniel and then end with Jeff on that question.
Yep. So actually for me, one day I was going to a conference in Calgary, which is quite far from me because I live in Ontario. And I was presenting one of my projects, but by chance, actually my supervisor, my research supervisor from another project was there as one of the speakers. So I was quite shocked when I saw the uh, program and I saw that he was speaking at the event. So I obviously attended his talk, and then afterward, we met up and we actually got dinner together. So the reason why this was one of my favorite memories was because he told me a lot about his personal life, his family back home, his dog, his dreams to one day go back to France and practice research there instead of Canada. And it was very important for me because I got to know my supervisor on a personal level and realized that in some ways he's human too. Because a lot of the times we look up to our supervisors and be like, oh, like they know everything. Like this is nuts. How could I ever be like their level? And it was really good for me to see like what someone else in that position was like on a personal level, and it humanizes them. So that for me, that was probably my most fun memory.
Amazing. Alrighty.
So most fun memory in science. I think that would definitely have to be the first summer internship that I did. I think I was like 18 or 19, I think, after sophomore. And my first time getting out of my comfort zone. So I think it was at Boston, so at your institute, Maggie, the Harvard Stem Cell Institute. And so I thought that, oh, it's in the East Coast, so it must be really cold. So I brought all my winter jackets in the middle of summer in Boston. So I don't know if any of you have been there. It's humid, very humid. It's almost like you're in a tropical island. So half my suitcase was winter clothes. But but it was really fun because I met like-minded people. There were other cohorts that were there that were also equally excited to do research, and mentors that were really great because they wanted to take on summer students. And there's still people that I keep in contact. My favorite experience is not necessarily the science, but also the environment as well. Walking around the historical Boston area, renting a place that looked like it was from a barn, having great roommates in that place. And yeah, so definitely try summer internships and don't bring a jacket.
I didn't know that, but that's amazing. That's a great story. Alrighty, sorry to go a little bit over time, but I just really wanted to thank on behalf of everybody, our attendees and our conference planning team, to all of the speakers today. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us. It's really an inspiration for us undergrads to see people like you, and all of the amazing work that you're doing, and to hear you talk about it and to talk candidly about your experiences. So thank you again for spending some time on a Saturday afternoon with us. We hope that you stay safe and stay healthy and happy throughout this weekend and through the new year. And thank you so much again for everything today. Alrighty. Thanks, guys. See you all later. Have a nice weekend.
Organizing. See you.
Of course.